Well, for more on OPEC's efforts to stabilize the oil market, Ramah, Nyang, host of Global Business Africa, spoke to CCTV's Paul Barber.
Just to set the stage for the meeting, the difference between this meeting and what happened way back in April is that at least this time the Iranians do have a seat at the table. You'll recall, of course, that the deal back in April fell apart at the last minute, mainly because the Saudis and the Iranians simply could not agree on output curbs, who was supposed to reduce output and for what particular reason. The problem they're facing here is pretty much the same one that they faced in 2015 and even before that, way back in 2014. It's a simple problem of oversupply from one perspective. The problem, however, is at that time, after 2014, the agreed to response was to remove output curbs and let everyone pretty much pump whatever they want in an effort to regain market share. Since then, however, oil prices have fallen, in fact, to 12-year lows way back in February. And that has been a concern for a lot of these petrol-reliant economies. Nigeria, for example, is suffering particularly badly. We're seeing the same thing happening in Venezuela as well. In fact, earlier today, Nigeria did announce a deal with the African Development Bank. They're going to be getting about $1 billion or so to fund their fiscal deficit. The problem for all of these countries, however, is for them to actually achieve the outcome they all want, to prop prices to a level where they get back to enable them to at least balance their public budgets. They have to all collectively reduce their output. And they're not willing to trust each other to actually pull that off. And that right there is the nub of the problem. Without going into the Middle Eastern dispute we're seeing, of course, within that region between the Saudis and the Iranians.
Ramah, you mentioned Nigeria there. It's an OPEC member. It's Africa's second largest oil producer. It's really been suffering from these low oil prices. But how much of a say does Abuja have at the table at these OPEC meetings?
Well, to put it bluntly, not much, with about 1.5 million barrels of crude of output every single day. If you take them alone, they account for a really small fraction of total OPEC oil output, which by the end of August was about 33 million barrels of crude a day collectively. And a huge chunk of that is coming directly from the Gulf producers, the Saudi Arabian producers, Iraq, Iran, and so on. So in that sense of, given those numbers, Nigeria really doesn't have any clout whatsoever to actually come to the table and tell the Middle East and the Gulf producers, listen guys, whatever political issues you guys have amongst yourselves, sort it out. We need to get oil prices back up. And they're paying a very steep price for where oil prices are right now. The oil sector accounts for about 10% of Nigeria's GDP, but it accounts for over 70% of government revenue. And the reduction in oil prices has decimated government earnings. And you're seeing that effect, that knock-on effect happening in taking effect rather in the real economy. The dollar-naira rate, for example, that has fallen off a cliff. It hit 469 naira to the dollar in the black market today. Inflation is at multi-year highs, well over 16%. Nigeria is in a really tight spot right now, but unfortunately for them, they just don't have the power to turn things around, at least not as far as OPEC is concerned.
Thanks to Ramah and Nyang there from Nairobi and Global Business Africa. Now, another major conference happening on the continent this week concerns wildlife and the urgent need to protect endangered species from poaching. At the CITES gathering in Johannesburg, environmental ministers and activists from around the world are considering adding to the list of species under trade controls. Most attention is focused on elephant poaching, as new figures show Africa's elephant population has suffered its worst drop in 25 years. For more on the possible outcomes of the CITES conference, CCTV spoke with Ross Harvey from the South African Institute for International Affairs.
What we're going to find at COP17 is that many countries will vote in favour of extending the international ban on ivory into domestic markets, which we think is a good move because that helps to prevent the intertwining that's happened where illegal ivory just gets laundered through legal domestic markets once it's entered a country like China, for instance. I think what will also be significant is that most countries will probably vote to keep elephants on Appendix 1. There's scientific grounds for that. But I think that this COP probably, as heated as it would be, probably carries the biggest chance for elephants to be preserved, because I think there's also increasing recognition that CITES can't do it alone. And so many member states are looking to partner with other environmental agencies, multilateral forums, to try and address the poaching problem. We think that rhino horn will remain contentious, but we think that there'll be probably near consensus on that. The fact that South Africa has chosen not to promote a legalized trade in rhino horn is a big deal. there will be discussion around what happens domestically, because there's a struggle to lift the moratorium both locally and internationally.
Along with poaching, drought and armed conflict are threatening animals in one of Mozambique's national parks. Clashes between the army and rebels have revived the spectre of a civil war that ended 20 years ago. Mozambique's Gorongosa National Park is the country's largest wildlife sanctuary. Its serene beauty masks a history of violence. In the Sena language, Gorongosa means place of danger and death. Nearly 2 decades of civil war devastated it. It's been peaceful for the past 10 years, but now, with a severe drought and as a rebel uprising brews in the middle of the country, the park's biodiversity is once again under threat.
People die. There's hunger, disease. All of it comes from the conflict within the country. During the civil war, they destroyed everything, and we had to rebuild. This time, I don't know whether they're going to destroy or not.
The park is now home to more than 72,000 animals, protected by 150 rangers and a team of scientists. Elephants and waterbuck roam the reserve, thanks to a restoration project funded by an American philanthropist. But despite the park's resources, there's concern nearby fighting could ruin it all. Fleeing villagers in search of food are also poaching the animals.
Gorongosa Park is a prime target only because people can no longer harvest enough, and so they go after the animals in an effort to feed themselves.
Mozambique's guerrilla fighters picked up arms 3 years ago against the ruling party, in power since independence in 1975. The rebels' leader lives in hiding in the mountains beside the park. The recent violence has led to a dramatic drop in visitor numbers, down from 7,000 4 years ago to just 1,000 last year.
People are afraid to come here. Today, for example, we have 4 tourists. All the other occupants work directly or indirectly for the park. They're scientists or other employees.
Despite the peace talks between the government and Renamo rebels, the park's fragile ecosystem remains threatened from drought, poaching and conflict. Gorongosa may not be able to escape the fate of its name. Paul Barber, CCTV.